Sometimes the smallest act of kindness arrives right before somebody gives up hope. Snow moved sideways through the dark Colorado night, like torn pieces of paper caught in the wind, thick enough to blur headlights and bury tire tracks within minutes. Caleb Turner tightened both hands against the steering wheel of his aging pickup truck as he turned onto Maple Ridge Road, the tires crunching softly over fresh snow. Most people in Cedar Hollow had already gone home hours ago. Christmas lights still glowed faintly through frosted windows, warm little pockets of life hidden behind heavy curtains and locked doors. But out here near the edge of town, winter felt lonelier, quieter, the kind of silence that settled deep in a man when he had spent too many years carrying memories nobody else could see. Caleb had lived in Cedar Hollow for almost 3 years now, though some days it still felt temporary, like he had only stopped moving long enough to catch his breath. Before that came the military. Before that came deployments nobody asked about. Before silence became easier than conversation. He worked small repair jobs around town now. Fixing heaters, snowblowers, broken pipes when winter storms pushed old homes too hard. Honest work. Quiet work. The kind that asked little from him except showing up. Tonight had been longer than usual. A broken furnace at the diner. Frozen plumbing at the church. One stranded family needing jumper cables outside the grocery store. By the time Caleb left the gas station after grabbing black coffee and a sandwich wrapped in paper, the storm had worsened. Wind rattled against the truck doors hard enough to make the whole cab tremble. He almost missed her. A small shape beneath the old bus stop near Miller Street. At first he thought somebody had left trash bags near the bench. Then the shape moved. Caleb slowed immediately. Something in him shifted before his mind caught up. Instinct. The kind training never fully erased. He pulled the truck over and stepped into the cold. Wind cut through his jacket instantly. Snow hit his face sharp and unforgiving. The bus stop sat mostly buried beneath drifting snow, flickering yellow light from an overhead lamp barely reaching the bench below. That was when he saw her clearly. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Knees pulled tight against her chest beneath a thin sweatshirt far too small for weather like this. Her fingers looked pink from cold, hair damp from snow, and tucked tightly against her stomach rested a tiny puppy no bigger than a football, trembling hard enough Caleb could see it from 6 feet away. The puppy pressed close to the girl's coatless chest, as if trying to share warmth neither of them had enough of. Caleb crouched carefully several feet away, making his voice softer than usual. "Hey there." The girl looked up fast, guarded eyes, nervous. The kind of look children only learned after trusting the wrong people too many times. The puppy gave a weak little bark before tucking closer into her arms. "You out here by yourself?" Caleb asked gently. No answer, just silence and wind pushing snow through the broken sides of the shelter. Caleb glanced around. Empty road. No parked cars. No nearby footsteps. No worried parents searching. Something about that settled heavy in his chest. "You cold?" he asked quietly, already knowing the answer. The girl gave the smallest nod imaginable. Caleb stood slowly. Without overthinking it, he pulled off his heavy military coat. Old brown canvas, worn around the sleeves, still warm from body heat. The only coat he trusted when Colorado winters turned ugly. He stepped closer carefully and draped it gently over both the girl and puppy. The coat nearly swallowed them whole. For a second, the girl froze in place, surprised, like kindness had caught her off guard. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of old knit gloves he kept for emergencies. "These two." Her voice finally appeared, quiet and uncertain. "You are going to freeze." Caleb almost smiled. "I will survive." Snow continued falling harder around them. The puppy slowly peeked out from beneath the coat, dark little eyes fixed strangely on Caleb. Not scared. Watching. Studying him somehow. Caleb looked back toward the truck. Heater still running. Warm air waiting inside. "Come on," he said gently. "I know a diner's still open. Hot chocolate for you. Something warm for your little friend." The girl hesitated, arms tightening around the puppy. Fear again. Caleb recognized it. He had worn that same look himself years ago after too many things stopped making sense. "You do not have to trust me right away," he said softly. "But nobody should be out here tonight." Wind pushed harder through the shelter. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang faintly through snow. The puppy shifted suddenly, nose lifting into the cold air. Then, To Caleb's surprise, it wriggled free from the girl's arms and walked carefully through the snow straight toward him. Tiny paws. Shivering body. No hesitation. It stopped near Caleb's boots and looked up, tail barely moving. The girl stared in disbelief. "He never goes to strangers," she whispered. Caleb looked down at the puppy for a long second, then back toward the girl. "Guess he made the first decision for both of us." For the first time all night, the girl almost smiled. Warm air filled the truck slowly as snow tapped against the windshield like quiet fingers asking to be let in. Caleb kept the heater running while the little girl sat carefully in the passenger seat wrapped inside his oversized military coat. The puppy curled tightly against her chest beneath layers of worn canvas and warmth. Neither of them said much at first. Outside, Cedar Hollow looked softer beneath fresh snowfall. Christmas lights blinked quietly from rooftops while tire tracks disappeared almost as quickly as they formed. Caleb glanced over once, careful not to make her nervous. She looked smaller now that she had stopped shivering so hard. Pale cheeks, wet strands of hair stuck near her face. Tired eyes far too old for someone her age. The puppy had finally stopped trembling too, nose tucked beneath her arm. "What is his name?" Caleb asked quietly after a while. The girl looked down at the little dog. "Scout." Caleb nodded once. "Good name." Silence settled again before he added gently, "And yours?" She hesitated long enough for him to think she might not answer. "Maddie." Her voice came out small, careful, like trust still hurt. "Well, Maddie," Caleb said softly, eyes staying on the snowy road ahead. Scout made a strong first impression. For the first time since he met her, she gave the smallest, almost smile. Tiny. Gone quickly. But there. 5 minutes later they pulled into Hollow Creek Diner, one of the few places in town still glowing near midnight. Warm yellow lights spilled across snowdrifts outside, while steam fogged the windows from inside. Caleb parked near the entrance and looked toward Maddie. "How about hot chocolate?" She hesitated again. "We do not have money." Caleb shook his head once. "Tonight is covered." Inside, warmth hit instantly. Smell of coffee. Cinnamon rolls cooling near the counter. Bacon from the late shift grill. Christmas music low through old ceiling speakers. Only 3 customers remained, scattered quietly across booths. Grace Holloway stood behind the register wiping mugs with the kind of practiced rhythm only small-town diner owners ever mastered. She looked up immediately when Caleb walked in carrying Scout, while Maddie followed beside him swallowed inside the oversized coat. Her expression shifted fast. Curiosity first, then concern. "Lord above," Grace muttered softly. "What happened?" Caleb lowered his voice. "Found them out near Miller Street." Grace looked toward Maddie carefully, not pushing too hard. "Honey, you freezing?" Maddie gave a tiny nod. Grace disappeared toward the kitchen without another word. "Booth near the heater," she called back. "Now." Caleb slid into the diner booth while warm air from the nearby vent drifted softly upward. Scout curled beside Maddie against the seat, eyes finally closing halfway as exhaustion began winning over fear. Minutes later, Grace returned balancing steaming hot chocolate topped with whipped cream, grilled cheese sandwiches, warm soup, and a small plate with shredded chicken for Scout. "Nobody leaves my diner hungry," Grace said simply. Maddie stared at the food for several seconds like she almost forgot meals could arrive warm. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb watched quietly as she finally took the first careful sip of hot chocolate. Her shoulders softened almost immediately. Scout ate fast, but politely beside her. Something about the sight settled strangely inside Caleb. Maybe because loneliness recognized loneliness. Maybe because winter had a way of reminding people how much warmth mattered. Grace slid into the booth beside Caleb briefly, voice lower now. "You know this kid?" Caleb shook his head once. "Just met her." Grace frowned toward Maddie. "No parents." Caleb glanced over. Maddie kept her eyes lowered, still figuring that out. Grace nodded slowly but wisely let the moment breathe. Across the diner, snow thickened harder outside windows. Midnight came quietly. Caleb noticed Maddie fighting sleep now, exhaustion pulling at her eyes despite trying to stay alert. Like resting still felt unsafe somehow. "You got somewhere warm tonight?" he asked gently. Maddie hesitated. Scout lifted his head slowly. "Mom said," she paused. "Mom said not everybody who helps wants to stay." Something inside Caleb shifted at those words. The kind of sadness that sat too heavy for a child to carry alone. Before he could answer, Scout suddenly stood up. tiny paws landing softly against diner tile. The puppy walked toward the front window and stared outside into falling snow, then looked back toward Caleb. Waiting. Strange. Intentional somehow. Caleb frowned slightly. What is he doing? Maddie whispered. Scout moved again. Straight toward the front door this time. Waiting there now. Small tail moving once. Caleb stood slowly. Looks like he wants something. Grace crossed her arms. At this hour? Caleb glanced toward the storm. Maybe. He crouched beside Scout near the door. What is going on, little guy? Scout looked at him for a long second, then gently placed one paw against Caleb's boot. Outside, wind moved harder across empty streets. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang midnight softly through snow. Maddie pulled the oversized coat tighter around herself and looked quietly toward Caleb. For the first time all evening, something like fear slipped across her face again. Please, she whispered carefully. Do not leave us here. Caleb looked at her for a moment longer than expected, then gave one quiet nod. You are not staying out in this storm. And if this story is touching your heart so far, please remember to like and subscribe so you do not miss more unforgettable stories still waiting ahead. Snow continued falling long after midnight, covering Cedar Hollow in quiet white stillness, while warm light spilled softly across the parking lot outside Hollow Creek Diner. Caleb stood near his truck for a moment, cold air brushing against his face while he stared through the diner window at Maddie and Scout. The little girl sat curled beneath his oversized military coat, head lowered over a half-finished mug of hot chocolate, while Scout slept beside her on the booth seat. Something about the way she held herself unsettled him. Not fear exactly. More like exhaustion disguised as caution. Like someone too young had spent too much time learning how to survive alone. Caleb stepped back inside, snow melting from his boots onto the diner floor. Grace stood near the coffee machine refilling mugs, watching Maddie quietly. She still has not said much. Grace asked softly. Caleb shook his head. Enough to know something is wrong. Grace frowned. You calling somebody? Caleb leaned lightly against the counter. Maybe. He paused. But not tonight. Grace gave him a long look before nodding once. Small towns work differently. People knew when somebody needed rules and when somebody needed warmth first. Across the diner, Maddie had nearly fallen asleep sitting upright. Scout remained tucked against her side now, tiny body finally warm, chest rising and falling slowly beneath soft brown fur. Caleb walked back to the booth and crouched slightly so he did not tower over her. Hey. Maddie blinked awake. You sleepy? She rubbed her eyes once. Tiny nod. Caleb glanced outside where snow drifted heavier beneath streetlights. Storm is not slowing down. Maddie looked immediately uneasy again. We can leave, she said quietly, trying to sound brave in the way children sometimes do when they expect disappointment before it arrives. Caleb shook his head once. Nobody is leaving tonight. Her eyes lowered quickly, like she wanted to believe him but had learned better. Caleb looked toward Scout. The puppy had finally woken up too, dark eyes fixed carefully on him again. Watching. Measuring somehow. Strange little dog. Caleb stood and reached for his truck keys. Come on. Maddie hesitated. Where? Cabin has heat, Caleb answered simply. Extra blankets too. Her shoulders tightened instantly. Mom said. She stopped herself. Caleb waited. After a moment she whispered. Mom said not everybody stays kind after they stop smiling. Something about those words landed harder than expected. Caleb knew enough about disappointment to recognize the shape of it. He crouched again, voice calm. Then how about this? He said gently. You do not have to trust me tonight. Maddie looked up slowly. You can trust Scout. The puppy lifted his head at the sound of his name. Caleb gave the smallest nod toward him. If he thinks I am trouble, I guess he can bark at me all night. For the first time, Maddie smiled a little longer than before. Small. Careful, but real. 20 minutes later, the truck moved quietly through snow-covered roads toward the edge of Cedar Hollow, where pine trees stretched thick into the mountains. Caleb's cabin sat outside town, near an old creek that nearly froze every winter. Nothing fancy, just wood walls, stone fireplace, quiet porch, and enough space for someone who mostly preferred silence. Maddie stayed quiet during the drive, curled against the oversized coat while Scout slept across her lap. Every few minutes Caleb caught her watching snowy roads through the window like she expected somebody to suddenly appear. Or disappear. The cabin lights came into view through falling snow shortly after 1 in the morning. warm amber glow against dark woods. Smoke rising gently from the chimney. Caleb parked slowly. Home sweet home, he said quietly, though the words felt strange leaving his mouth. Home had not meant much in years. Inside, warmth wrapped around them instantly. Fire still burned softly inside the stone fireplace from earlier that evening. The scent of cedarwood lingered in the air. Maddie stopped near the doorway, eyes moving slowly around the room. Old bookshelves, fishing gear near the wall, worn couch, Christmas lights Caleb forgot to unplug near the window. Nothing fancy, just safe. Scout climbed carefully from her arms and began sniffing the cabin immediately, tiny tail wagging once or twice. Then, to Caleb's surprise, the puppy walked directly toward the fireplace and curled into a blanket near the rug like he already knew the place. Maddie looked nervous again. We should not stay long. Caleb grabbed extra blankets from the hallway closet. You can leave when the roads stop trying to freeze people. He pointed gently toward the couch. You sleep there. I will take the chair. You do not have to, Maddie whispered. Caleb almost smiled. Military taught me how to sleep anywhere. Outside, wind brushed softly against cabin walls while snow continued falling through pine trees. For the first time all night, warmth settled across the room. Quiet warmth. The kind that arrived when somebody finally stopped running long enough to breathe. Caleb brought warm cocoa from the kitchen while Scout had already fallen asleep near the fire. Maddie looked toward the puppy for a long moment before speaking again, softer this time. Scout likes you. Caleb sat carefully near the fireplace. Guess that makes one of us. Maddie frowned slightly. You do not like you? Caleb stared quietly into the fire for a second longer than expected. Working on it, he admitted softly. Silence followed. Comfortable somehow. Snow outside. Fire inside. Small moments that felt bigger than they should. Then, just before sleep finally pulled at her eyes, Maddie whispered something so quietly Caleb almost missed it. Mom said if winter ever got too cold, she paused. Find the people who still remember kindness. Caleb looked toward her slowly. But before he could ask anything else, Maddie had already drifted asleep beneath his old military coat, while Scout rested quietly nearby, ears twitching softly in dreams. Morning arrived quietly beneath pale winter sunlight spilling through frosted cabin windows. Snow rested thick across pine branches outside, while the creek near Caleb's porch moved slowly beneath thin sheets of ice. The storm had softened sometime before dawn, leaving behind the kind of silence that only arrived after heavy snowfall. Inside the cabin, warmth from the fireplace still lingered gently through the air. Caleb woke first in the old recliner near the window, neck stiff from sleeping badly, but familiar with discomfort enough not to mind. For a moment, he forgot someone else was there. Then he heard soft laughter. Small, careful, uncertain. Caleb opened his eyes fully. Maddie sat cross-legged near the fireplace wrapped inside one of his oversized blankets while Scout tumbled clumsily across the rug chasing a loose shoelace he had somehow stolen from Caleb's boots. Tiny paws sliding awkwardly against hardwood floors. Tail wagging hard enough to throw off his balance. Maddie laughed again, quieter this time when she noticed Caleb awake. Like joy still surprised her. Guess somebody likes stealing military gear, Caleb said, voice rough from sleep. Scout stopped instantly and looked up guilty for approximately 2 seconds before grabbing the lace again and running 3 feet before slipping sideways. Maddie smiled properly now. Real smile this time. Small but brighter than anything Caleb had seen since finding her beneath the bus stop. He likes warm places, she said softly. Caleb stood slowly and stretched stiff shoulders. Cannot blame him. The cabin smelled faintly of cedarwood and cold mountain air creeping through window seams. Caleb headed toward the kitchen. Pancakes or eggs? Maddie looked confused. Both. Caleb almost smiled. Good answer. Breakfast came slowly. Warm pancakes. Scrambled eggs. Hot cocoa again for Maddie. Scout received scrambled eggs in a bowl he treated like treasure. Outside, sunlight reflected across untouched snowfields while smoke drifted lazily from the chimney overhead. It felt strange somehow. Domestic. Quiet. Caleb had not shared breakfast with anybody in years. Not since military friends stopped calling. Not since loneliness became routine enough to stop hurting quite so loudly. Maddie barely spoke while eating, but something had softened. Shoulders less tense. Hands steadier. Scout stayed close to her chair, occasionally glancing toward Caleb with unusual attention for such a tiny dog, like he was always listening for something. After breakfast, Caleb stepped outside briefly to shovel the porch before roads froze harder. Fresh air bit sharply against his face while snow crunched beneath heavy boots. The mountains surrounding Cedar Hollow stood bright beneath morning light, peaceful in the way winter sometimes tricked people into forgetting how lonely it could become. When Caleb stepped back inside 20 minutes later, Scout stood waiting near the front door. Tail stiff, focused, different somehow. The puppy paced once toward the door, then back toward Maddie, then toward Caleb. Waiting. Caleb frowned slightly. You need out. Scout gave one tiny bark. Not playful. Intentional. Maddie looked up immediately. He only does that when he wants to go somewhere. Caleb grabbed his coat. Where? Maddie lowered her eyes. I do not know. Scout moved again, pawing lightly at the door now. Persistent. Caleb hesitated only a second before opening it. Cold air slipped inside immediately. Scout ran into the snow without hesitation, stopping halfway down the porch steps and looking back. Waiting again. Caleb exchanged a glance with Maddie. Guess we are following him. Maddie bundled into winter clothes borrowed from extra storage Caleb somehow forgot he still had. Old gloves, thick scarf, boots slightly too large but warm enough. Together they followed Scout through quiet roads leading back toward town. Snow crunched softly beneath boots while morning sunlight reflected across frozen sidewalks. Scout never wandered far ahead. Every few yards, he stopped to make sure they followed. Purposeful, like he already knew exactly where he wanted to go. 20 minutes later, Scout turned down Willow Street toward an old building near the center of Cedar Hollow. The town library, closed for winter repairs. Windows dark. Snow piled against brick walls untouched for days. Scout stopped near the side entrance and barked softly once. Caleb frowned. Library. Maddie suddenly went quiet. Too quiet. She lowered her head. We should not be here. Caleb looked toward her carefully. Why? She hesitated. Scout scratched lightly against the old service door. Maddie looked ready to cry suddenly, small hands trembling inside gloves. Sometimes, she whispered. Sometimes Mom brought us here when it got too cold. Caleb stood still for a moment. Something heavy settled inside his chest. You stayed here? Maddie nodded once. After she got sick. Wind moved softly between nearby buildings. Somewhere downtown, church bells rang quietly through winter air. Caleb looked toward the locked side entrance, then toward Maddie. You said your mom told you to find people who still remembered kindness. Maddie stared at the snow. She said people forget sometimes. Scout barked again near the door. Caleb stepped closer and noticed something strange. The door was not locked all the way. Slight gap near the frame, like somebody had used it recently. He exchanged another glance with Maddie. Scout looked back at both of them again, waiting patiently. Certain. Caleb reached slowly toward the handle. Something about the moment felt bigger than it should have, like winter itself had quietly been leading them here all along. The old service door opened with a quiet creak that echoed softly through the cold winter air. Dust drifted lazily through pale sunlight sneaking between cracked blinds while the smell of old paper and forgotten rooms settled around them. Caleb stepped inside first, instinct moving ahead of thought the way it always had. Years of military training never disappeared entirely. Even peaceful silence made him observant. Scout hurried past his boots immediately, tiny paws clicking softly against worn wooden floors as though he already knew exactly where he wanted to go. Maddie stayed near the doorway for a moment, wrapped tightly in Caleb's oversized coat, eyes lowered toward the floor. The library looked frozen in time. Rows of books covered with thin blankets of dust. Stacked chairs near reading tables. Holiday decorations still hanging crookedly from months earlier, like nobody had ever returned to finish putting life back together. Outside, snow pressed gently against tall windows, muting the world beyond. Scout barked once near the back hallway. Caleb glanced over. Guess our guide found something. Maddie swallowed nervously but followed. They moved slowly through narrow aisles until Scout stopped near a small reading room tucked behind children's bookshelves. The puppy scratched lightly against another door. Caleb reached for the handle carefully. Unlocked again. Inside sat a tiny room no bigger than a storage office. But it was not empty. Blankets folded neatly across an old couch. Small lantern. Stack of canned soup. Coloring books piled beside children's novels. A backpack hanging near the wall. Someone had been staying here recently. Caleb looked toward Maddie quietly. She stood frozen. Mom used to bring me here, she whispered. Her voice felt smaller now somehow. More fragile. After chemo days. Caleb stayed quiet. Sometimes silence held more kindness than questions. Maddie walked slowly toward the old couch and touched one folded blanket carefully with trembling fingers. She said libraries feel safe because stories never yell at you. The sentence landed heavier than she probably meant it to. Caleb looked around again. Near the corner sat a small wooden box tucked beneath the table. Scout was already beside it, tail moving slowly. Waiting. Caleb crouched carefully and pulled it closer. Dust covered the lid except for one clean space where someone had touched it recently. Maddie's breath caught softly. That is Mom's. Caleb looked up. You sure? She nodded immediately. She kept important things in there. Caleb opened the lid carefully. Inside rested photographs tied with ribbon, old greeting cards, a folded map of Cedar Hollow, several envelopes with handwritten names on them, and resting on top sat a sealed letter in faded handwriting. Across the front were only 3 words. For winter days. Maddie stared at it silently, fingers shaking again. Caleb hesitated. Want me to read it? She looked uncertain, then nodded once. Carefully, Caleb unfolded the letter while Scout curled quietly beside Maddie's boots. The paper crackled softly with age. He cleared his throat gently and began reading. If you are opening this, sweetheart, winter probably feels colder than we hoped. Maddie lowered her head immediately. Caleb continued softly. I know you miss me. I wish I could still make cocoa and tell you everything will be fine. But sometimes people have to leave before they are ready. The room fell impossibly still. Outside, snow drifted quietly against frozen windows. Caleb read slower now. If things ever get hard, find the people who still remember kindness. Cedar Hollow helped us once, even if they forgot later. Some hearts just need reminders. Caleb paused briefly before reading the final lines. And trust Scout. He always knows where warmth lives. Maddie quietly wiped her eyes with the sleeve of Caleb's coat. No crying sounds. Just sadness too familiar for someone so young. Caleb folded the letter gently and placed it back into her hands. Your mom sounds pretty smart. Maddie looked down at the paper. She helped people. Caleb noticed something inside the wooden box he had missed earlier. More envelopes. Dozens of them. Each labeled with names. Local names. Familiar names. Cedar Hollow names. Grace Holloway. Mayor Evelyn Brooks. Pastor Green. Even the mechanic who fixed Caleb's truck twice. Caleb frowned slightly. What are these? Maddie looked uncertain. Mom said people forgot good things when life got hard. Caleb opened one envelope carefully addressed to Grace. Inside rested a handwritten note and an old grocery receipt marked paid in full from years ago. Another envelope held hospital bills quietly covered for somebody else. Another had a handwritten thank you card from a struggling family. Caleb slowly understood. Maddie's mother had been helping this town for years. Quietly. Secretly. Without asking for anything back. Yet nobody had spoken her name once. Scout stood suddenly near the door and barked softly again. Waiting. Like he was not finished leading them yet. Caleb looked toward Maddie. Then toward the stack of letters. Something larger than coincidence settled quietly into the room. Outside, Cedar Hollow continued moving through winter without realizing part of its own forgotten heart had been hidden here all along. Caleb looked back at Maddie and spoke softly enough not to disturb the stillness. I think your mom wanted somebody to remember. Snow drifted softly outside the library windows while sunlight stretched pale across the quiet reading room, turning dust into tiny floating sparks. Caleb stood holding one of the envelopes for a moment longer than expected. Grace Holloway. Mayor Evelyn Brooks. Pastor Green. Familiar names stacked carefully inside a wooden box forgotten by nearly everyone except one little girl and her puppy. Maddie sat quietly near the old couch, fingers wrapped around her mother's letter, like letting go might somehow erase the sound of her voice. Scout rested against her boots, though every few moments his ears twitched toward the hallway, as if he still sensed unfinished business waiting somewhere nearby. Caleb looked around the room again. Blankets folded carefully, canned food stacked neatly, coloring books placed beside old chapter novels. Somebody had built survival into kindness here. Quiet kindness. The kind nobody noticed because it never asked for credit. Caleb exhaled slowly. How long were you and your mom staying here? Maddie shrugged softly. sometimes only nights, sometimes longer after hospital days. Caleb lowered himself onto the old chair near her. Nobody knew. She hesitated. Mom did not want people worrying. Caleb almost smiled sadly. Sounded familiar. People carrying too much pain alone always believed they were helping others by staying quiet. Scout suddenly stood again, tiny paws moving toward the back shelf beside the children's section. He sniffed low along the floor, tail moving slowly, then stopped near a metal filing cabinet pushed halfway beneath old blankets. He barked once. Caleb frowned. Again. Maddie looked up immediately. He only does that when something matters. Caleb stood and crossed the room. The cabinet looked old enough to belong in another decade. One drawer slightly open already. He pulled it carefully. Inside sat dozens more envelopes. Receipts. Newspaper clippings. Small photographs. Cedar Hollow Community Winter Drive. Family loses home after storm. Local volunteers step in. Anonymous donations save church heating fund. Single mother receives groceries for 6 months. Caleb flipped slowly through papers until something stopped him cold. Photograph. Younger Grace Holloway smiling beside a woman holding bags of groceries. The same woman Maddie resembled. Same eyes. Same smile. Another photo showed Mayor Evelyn years younger beside Christmas decorations outside the community center. Again, Maddie's mother stood quietly in the background helping string lights. Always nearby. Never center stage. Your mom helped everybody, Caleb said softly. Maddie looked down. She said people forget hard times after they stop hurting. Silence settled between them for a while. Outside, snow slipped quietly from pine branches under warming sunlight. Somewhere in the distance, church bells drifted faintly through town. Caleb reached for another envelope and opened it carefully. Inside sat handwritten thank you letters. One read, "Thank you for paying for Dad's medicine when we could not." Another, "We never knew who bought Christmas presents for our kids until now." Another simply said, "You saved us from losing our home." Caleb stared quietly at the words. Small kindnesses. Life-changing kindnesses. Done quietly enough for people to forget who carried them. Scout barked again suddenly. More urgent this time. Caleb looked over. The puppy stood near a bulletin board hanging crooked beside the door. One paper pinned there had partially fallen loose. Caleb walked closer. Beneath faded flyers sat an old handwritten map of Cedar Hollow marked with circles. Community center. Church kitchen. Food pantry. Shelter. Small handwritten words in the corner read, "Place's warmth should never disappear." Caleb swallowed hard unexpectedly. Maddie stepped beside him quietly. Mom wanted everybody to feel safe in winter. Caleb looked at her carefully. Did she ever tell you why? Maddie nodded slowly. She grew up cold. Simple answer. Heavy answer. Caleb understood more than he wanted to admit. Pain had strange ways of shaping people. Some became harder. Some became kinder. Maddie's mother had chosen kindness, even while hurting herself. Caleb looked again toward the envelopes, then toward the town outside those frosted windows moving through winter without realizing who once quietly held pieces of it together. People need to know, he said quietly. Maddie looked uncertain immediately. Mom did not like attention. Caleb nodded once. This is not about attention. He looked down at the letters. This is about remembering. Scout walked over and rested beside Maddie's leg, tail brushing gently against the floor. For the first time all morning, something softer crossed Maddie's face. Not sadness exactly, more like relief. Like somebody else finally saw what she had been carrying alone. Caleb checked the time. Nearly noon now. Snow still covered Cedar Hollow thick enough to slow everything down. Come on, he said gently. There is somebody we should talk to. Maddie frowned slightly. Who? Caleb folded one envelope carefully and held it up. Grace Holloway. Outside, cold air greeted them again, sharper now beneath bright winter skies. Scout trotted confidently ahead through fresh snow while Caleb carried the wooden box carefully beneath one arm. The library door clicked softly shut behind them. Cedar Hollow looked peaceful from a distance. Smoke from chimneys. Children building snowmen near front yards. Cars moving carefully through narrow streets. Nobody knew yet that winter had quietly hidden an entire story inside an abandoned library. Nobody knew a little girl and a tiny puppy had just reopened something the town forgot it ever needed. And somehow, walking beside Maddie through the snow, Caleb realized this stopped being about one cold night a long time ago. Something bigger had started the moment he gave away a coat he thought meant nothing anymore. Grace Holloway was wiping down coffee mugs when the diner door opened and cold winter air drifted inside behind Caleb, Maddie, and Scout. The lunch crowd had not arrived yet. Only soft country music played from the old radio near the pie display, while sunlight stretched warmly across empty booths. Grace looked up with a familiar smile that faded almost immediately when she noticed the expression on Caleb's face and the wooden box tucked carefully beneath his arm. "Everything all right?" she asked gently. Caleb removed snow from his boots near the door. "Not sure yet." Maddie stood quietly beside him, wrapped inside the oversized military coat, while Scout sat near her feet watching everything with surprising calm for such a little dog. Grace noticed the girl first, then the box. Something shifted in her expression. Recognition almost arrived before understanding caught up. "Why do I feel like somebody just walked in carrying a storm?" she asked softly. Caleb motioned toward the corner booth near the heater. "Might be easier sitting down." 20 minutes later, coffee sat untouched beside Grace, while sunlight drifted lazily across the tabletop. Caleb spread several envelopes carefully between them. Handwritten names, old photographs, grocery receipts, quiet acts of kindness forgotten by time. Grace reached slowly for the photograph Caleb had found earlier. Younger version of herself standing outside Hollow Creek Diner beside a smiling woman holding bags of groceries. Her breath caught immediately. "Emily," she whispered. Maddie lowered her eyes. Grace looked up fast, then back at Maddie. Slowly, carefully, like memory was putting together pieces it had lost years ago. "You are," she stopped herself. Maddie gave the smallest nod. "My mom." Silence settled hard around the booth. Grace looked stunned for several seconds. "Good Lord," she whispered again, softer now. "Emily Brooks." Scout rested quietly beside Maddie's chair, while Caleb slid one envelope closer. "Found these at the library." Grace opened the first letter carefully, then another, and another. Her eyes watered faster than she expected. One receipt showed groceries paid anonymously nearly 8 years earlier during the worst winter Cedar Hollow had faced in decades. Grace swallowed hard. "My husband had just lost work back then," she whispered quietly. "We were barely staying open." She looked at Maddie with disbelief still written across her face. "Your mother never told anybody." Maddie looked down at folded hands. She said helping matters more when people do not feel embarrassed. Grace covered her mouth briefly. Emotion moved quietly across her expression now. The kind grief leaves behind after memory returns unexpectedly. "I have not thought about Emily in years," she admitted softly. "She used to stop by the diner all the time. Always helping somebody. Always smiling." Her voice lowered. Then one day, she just stopped coming. Caleb glanced toward Maddie gently. "She got sick." Grace nodded slowly, regret crossing her face like cold wine through an old doorway. "And we forgot." Nobody spoke for several moments. Outside, snow slipped softly from rooftops beneath afternoon sunlight. Life moved through Cedar Hollow quietly, unaware something forgotten had just reopened inside one small diner booth. Grace wiped her eyes gently before reaching for another envelope labeled Mayor Evelyn Brooks. "She needs to see this," Grace said firmly. Caleb nodded once. "That is what I figured." 2 hours later, the small town hall meeting room slowly filled with familiar faces pulled together by curiosity and old winter schedules interrupted. Mayor Evelyn arrived first, still carrying paperwork beneath one arm and concern written plainly across her face. Pastor Green followed not long after. Then the mechanic from Main Street. Librarian Susan Parker. Several longtime residents. Grace stood near the front, clutching Emily's letters close against her chest, while Caleb remained near the back beside Maddie and Scout. Maddie looked nervous. Scout stayed pressed gently against her boots like he understood exactly when she needed steady company. Mayor Evelyn frowned slightly. Grace said this was important. Grace looked toward Maddie first before speaking. Somebody came back to Cedar Hollow. Quiet confusion moved through the room. Then Grace carefully placed the envelopes onto the table. "Or maybe," she corrected softly, voice trembling, "somebody we forgot never really left." One by one, letters opened. Receipts unfolded. Stories surfaced. Pastor Green sat quietly reading a note about church heating bills mysteriously covered during a brutal winter 10 years earlier. The mechanic stared speechless at an envelope showing rent assistance for his family after medical debt nearly forced them out of town. Mayor Evelyn froze reading one handwritten letter in Emily's familiar handwriting. Thank you for believing Cedar Hollow could still become Kinder. Tears appeared faster than anyone expected. Nobody cried loudly. No speeches. Just silence growing heavier as people realized how many moments of survival quietly traced back to one woman nobody remembered enough. Then Grace looked toward Maddie sitting quietly beside Caleb. This is Emily's daughter, she said softly. Every eye turned gently toward the little girl wrapped in an oversized military coat. Maddie looked ready to disappear into herself. Scout pressed closer against her leg. Caleb quietly placed one hand near the edge of the chair beside her. Steady, silent, present. Mayor Evelyn stood slowly and crossed the room. When she reached Maddie, she crouched carefully until they were eye level. Your mom mattered here, she said softly, voice shaking slightly. I am sorry we forgot to say thank you. Maddie looked down before whispering quietly enough, most almost missed it. Mom said winter makes people forget warm things sometimes. Nobody answered right away, because deep down, every person in that room knew she was right. The next morning, Cedar Hollow woke beneath pale sunlight, and something quieter than snow, but stronger than habit, had already begun moving through town. Word spread the way small-town stories always did. Slowly at first, then all at once. By breakfast, people who had sat inside the town hall the night before were already stopping by Hollow Creek Diner with old memories they had not thought about in years. Grace stood behind the counter pouring coffee, while wiping tears she pretended came from exhaustion. Every booth carried pieces of conversation. Emily paid for our heating bill one winter. She dropped groceries on our porch when nobody knew we were struggling. She stayed with Mom at the hospital when we could not. Nobody could quite understand how they had forgotten someone who quietly held so many pieces of Cedar Hollow together. Outside, snow melted gently beneath weak winter sunlight, while Scout trotted happily through fresh powder beside Maddie near Caleb's cabin. For the first time since arriving, the little girl looked lighter somehow. Not fully healed, not safe from sadness yet, but lighter. Caleb watched from the porch holding coffee, while cold mountain air drifted through pine trees. Maddie laughed quietly when Scout buried his nose into a pile of snow and came up sneezing in confusion. Small laugh. Real laugh. The kind that sounded unfamiliar after too much grief. Caleb had forgotten how much life changed the sound of a quiet house. A week earlier the cabin had felt empty enough to echo. Now Crayon sat near the coffee table. Scout slept wherever sunlight landed. Tiny Boots waited beside the front door. And somehow silence no longer felt so heavy. Around noon Grace arrived carrying paper bags full of food and enough casseroles to feed half the county. Apparently the town forgot boundaries overnight, she said while stepping inside. Everybody keeps dropping things off. Caleb frowned slightly at the growing pile near the kitchen counter. Blankets, winter clothes, children's books, dog food for Scout, grocery cards, handwritten notes. One envelope simply read, "For Emily's girl." Grace placed a folded flyer onto the table. Mayor Evelyn called this morning. Caleb looked down. Community Center volunteer reopening. Tonight. Everyone welcome. Maddie looked confused. The center is closed. Grace smiled softly. Not anymore, sweetheart. That evening the old community center glowed brighter than it had in years. Christmas lights lined the entrance despite January nearly ending. Smoke rose gently from food trucks parked outside, while volunteers carried paint buckets, folded chairs, donated coats, and boxes of canned food through wide-open doors. Caleb stood quietly near the entrance beside Maddie and Scout, unsure what exactly he expected. Certainly not this. Mayor Evelyn crossed the room carrying old blueprints tucked beneath one arm. Turns out, she said softly, your mom was helping fund this place quietly for years. She looked toward Maddie. Nobody knew how much she cared until now. Inside, walls once covered in dust slowly came alive again. Volunteers scrubbed tables. Teenagers painted murals. Church members organized food shelves. Somebody hung a new sign near the front entrance. Emily's winter house. Maddie stopped walking, small hands gripping the sleeves of Caleb's coat tighter. They named it after Mom. Grace knelt carefully beside her. Seems like warmth deserves a name. Scout barked softly as if approving the idea himself. Through the evening, people shared stories. Quiet stories. Forgotten stories. Pastor Green admitted Emily once secretly bought winter coats for children who arrived cold to church programs. Grace remembered anonymous meal deliveries during hard years. Mayor Evelyn confessed Emily had quietly paid utility bills for struggling seniors every winter without ever asking anyone to mention her name. Maddie listened quietly beside Caleb, eyes moving between faces. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Hollow, she no longer looked invisible. Caleb noticed it before anyone else. People stopped crouching toward her with pity and instead spoke to her with gratitude. Like she belonged to something larger than grief. Like she mattered because her mother mattered. Later that evening, Mayor Evelyn approached Caleb, holding something folded carefully in her hands. His old military coat. Clean now. Professionally repaired. Small patches stitched neatly where age had worn through fabric. Caleb blinked once in surprise. How? Grace smiled from nearby. Town project. Caleb ran a hand slowly over familiar canvas. Same coat. Somehow lighter now. Warmer too. Then Maddie pointed quietly toward the inside collar. Caleb turned it gently. Sewn carefully into the lining were tiny stitched words in uneven handwriting. Warm people make cold places softer. Caleb swallowed hard unexpectedly. Maddie looked nervous suddenly. I helped sew some letters, she whispered. Scout leaned against Caleb's leg quietly while snow drifted outside community center windows beneath glowing lights. People laughed, shared food, carried boxes, rebuilt something nobody realized they missed until it almost disappeared. Caleb looked around the room again, at strangers becoming neighbors, at warmth spreading quietly through old spaces, at one little girl smiling again beside a puppy who somehow always knew exactly where hope lived. And standing there in the middle of laughter and winter and second chances, Caleb realized kindness worked differently than most people imagined. Sometimes it disappeared quietly into the world, but somehow, years later, it still found a way back home. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Cedar Hollow one quiet morning at a time. Snowbanks shrank beside sidewalks. Icicles disappeared from rooftops. Pine trees softened beneath warmer sunlight. And somewhere between February winds and early spring rain, the town began feeling alive again. Emily's winter house never closed after reopening. What started as a simple act of remembering quietly turned into something bigger than anybody expected. Families stopped by for warm meals. Children borrowed books from shelves rebuilt inside the old community room. Seniors gathered for coffee near the fireplace, while volunteers stacked donated coats for anyone who still needed warmth. Nobody called it charity. Around Cedar Hollow, people started calling it something else instead. Neighboring. Caleb noticed the change most during quiet moments. Less loneliness in grocery store conversations. More headlights stopping for strangers during storms. Small kindnesses moving through town the same way snow once had. Quietly. Constantly. And somehow, at the center of it all stood a little girl who no longer lowered her eyes every time somebody said hello. Maddie changed too. Slowly at first. Then all at once in tiny ways only careful people noticed. She laughed more now. Slept through the night without waking afraid. Kept crayons spread across Caleb's kitchen table and somehow convinced Scout to wear a tiny knitted scarf Grace made, though the puppy tolerated it with visible confusion. Scout had grown too. Bigger paws now. Softer confidence. He followed Maddie everywhere like a quiet promise nobody needed to explain. Caleb still woke early most mornings, coffee in hand, standing on the cabin porch while sunlight climbed over mountains. But the silence no longer felt heavy. Inside the house came movement now. The sound of pancakes burning because Maddie forgot timers. Scout sliding across wooden floors chasing socks. Music playing low while breakfast happened badly, but happily. Strange thing about healing, Caleb learned. Sometimes it arrived so quietly a person almost missed it happening. One Saturday morning near the beginning of spring, Maddie stood near the kitchen table holding papers nervously against her chest. Can I ask something? Caleb looked up from fixing an old radio. Depends, he answered carefully. Are we talking pancakes or trouble? Maddie smiled faintly. School. Caleb sat straighter immediately. You want to go? She nodded once. Small but certain. I think Mom would want me to. Something about the sentence settled softly inside him. Like grief had finally made enough room for hope. 2 weeks later, Cedar Hollow Elementary welcomed Maddie with handmade signs taped near the entrance. Grace packed lunches too large. Mayor Evelyn donated school supplies. Pastor Green somehow organized enough books to overwhelm half the classroom. Even Scout became unofficially famous after waiting patiently outside pickup lines every afternoon beside Caleb's truck. By April, wildflowers began pushing carefully through thawed ground near the creek behind the cabin. One afternoon after school, Maddie sat on the porch steps coloring while Scout rested across her feet beneath warm sunlight. Caleb returned from town carrying groceries, only to stop halfway up the porch. Something rested carefully folded near the front door. His old military coat, freshly cleaned again. He frowned slightly. Thought I already got this back. Maddie looked suddenly nervous. Open the inside. Caleb unfolded the coat slowly and checked the inner lining where the stitched message remained. But now something new had been added in smaller thread beneath it. Different handwriting this time. Careful handwriting. Child handwriting. Thank you for stopping that night. Caleb stood quietly for a moment longer than expected. The mountains stretched endlessly beyond the porch while soft spring wind moved gently through pine branches overhead. Scout rolled lazily onto his side, perfectly content beneath sunlight. Maddie lowered her eyes. I just wanted you to know, she paused. You made winter feel less scary. Caleb sat beside her slowly. For years he had carried old memories like heavy snow nobody else could see. The military. Loss. Silence. Days spent believing purpose belonged to some earlier version of himself. But sitting there beside one little girl and one stubborn puppy, he realized something simple had quietly changed everything. Purpose had not disappeared. It had simply arrived looking different. That evening, Cedar Hollow gathered outside Emily's winter house for the annual spring lantern walk. Families laughed beneath glowing lights while warm soup simmered inside and music drifted gently through open windows. Maddie held Scout's leash carefully while Caleb stood nearby wearing the same old coat that somehow carried different meaning now. Mayor Evelyn stepped forward near sunset and placed a small plaque beside the entrance. In memory of Emily Brooks. May warmth always find its way home. Nobody clapped loudly. Nobody made speeches too long. People simply stood together beneath fading light, remembering someone who once quietly taught an entire town how kindness survived winter. Later that night, back at the cabin, Caleb sat alone on the porch while stars stretched endlessly overhead. Inside, Maddie and Scout already slept peacefully. Warm light spilled softly through windows into the cool spring air. Caleb looked down at the stitching hidden inside the coat one final time before smiling quietly to himself. Funny thing about kindness. Sometimes you gave it away thinking it was the last warm thing you had left, only to find out it somehow came back larger than before.